Well, the legislation that surrounds specifically the indecent images of children have protected children for a very long time. I think hitherto this generation certainly has engaged those offences and that legislation more so than any other generation before it. And I think that's why sometimes it feels like it's become such a massive problem. But it does protect the children right up to the age of 18, because under legislation a child is always a child until it reaches the age of 18. I think the difficulty in terms of where children get a bit confused and young people get a bit confused is because under the Sexual Offences Act 2008 the age of consent for sexual activity is 16. So a lot of children, rightly or wrongly, believe that because they can partake in sexual activity at the age of 16, that it naturally follows that they can share images of each other at 16. But that in fact is not the case. A child is a child up until the age of 18, and a child cannot share or receive or send indecent images of each other up to the age of 18. Well, any person who sends or receives an indecent image has automatically breached the legislation, and depending on the sanction could end up in the sex offenders register. That is hugely impactful in the rest of their lives in terms of the jobs that they'll be able to do. Anyone with a sexual conviction will never work with children or vulnerable adults, will never pass any vetting checks in terms of employment. You imagine, fast forward 10, 15 years, the difficulty to get employment will be impacted upon. A whole raft of consequences will follow if they get on the wrong side of this legislation. Well, if they break the law, they break the law. It's fundamental. If an offence is breached, we are duty bound as police officers in law enforcement to investigate, but we're not in the business of criminalising children. And that's the fact. And I mean, certainly with very recent development with our public prosecution service, there are guidelines in terms of how we'll progress investigations. Well, I come from a very specific background working within public protection as I do. I actually have the lead for managing the sexual and violent offenders within the area, within the Northern Trust boundary. And so I come from a very different perspective in that I am invariably managing the risk that registered sex offenders pose within the community. And one of my experiences has certainly been that I was managing an 18-year-old boy on the sex offenders register who had got on the wrong side of sexting legislation, and it was quite simply an experience whereby he was sharing images with his 16-year-old girlfriend. They had been in an intimate relationship for some time and fell on the wrong side of that legislation simply by sharing those images. And that young boy was just so massively impacted. He lost his university place, he had to move away from his community because of the impact of being on the register brought to the family. It was just massive, and I feel very strongly doing the job that I do that we don't need our young people being labelled with being deviant and risky because of something that they're doing that's naturally accepted within that teenage peer group. So it's really about educating and being really proactive in terms of how we deliver that message in a way that they listen and understand and acknowledge and accept. Well, technologically, we're very well supported by our child internet pornography team, and the technicians who could buy and sell me as far as ability is concerned. But if an indecent image is shared and a child is part of a sexting investigation, the first thing that's likely to happen is that their phone will be taken and it will be sent off to be triaged and forensically examined. And we do have the capability, we do have the technology to retrieve deleted images. So I liken the technology of the triage or the examination to be a wee bit like throwing a pebble in a pond. So we will start up close and personal to the first person who sent it, and that ripple effect that's created then will be followed up on. So I think in terms of the young people sending and receiving an image, they don't know when they send or receive an image where in that ripple effect they are. They can be very close to the first person who sent it, or they could be right out on the periphery. But in any event, we work our way out, and by virtue of that examination, we're able to establish who sent, who received. We can date stamp it, and we will know how long a young person kept an image for, who else they sent it to, and so on. So we do have that ability. So certainly the advice that I would give young people, that if you open an image and you see something that you know you couldn't show your granny, you get it off the phone. And that keeps you out of our investigations, absolutely. There's a lot of peer pressure among young people to conform, and that's been our experience within policing, has been the difficulty all along. We don't naturally anticipate or expect children to be able to cite chapter and verse of legislation. Sometimes it's difficult enough for us as police officers to remember those frameworks and work within those frameworks. But I think, I suppose as a rule of thumb, if a child is being asked to share an indecent image, one of the sort of key messages that we share with children is that the definition, the legal definition of indecent is simply not decent. And that's different from generation to generation, never mind from child to child, depending on what exposure they've had, what their experiences are, maybe what their religious beliefs are, and what their upbringing has put into them as well. So what we often say to our children when we're doing lesson plans, etc., is to remind them that the person who ultimately will decide whether an image is indecent or not is a judge. And that judge invariably will be someone the age of maybe their grandparents or their great-grandparents. So when they're thinking about what images they send or receive, to actually ask themselves before they send anything, could I actually show my granny this image? Would my granny be happy to receive this image? Or as I'm about to lay on the rug and strike a pose, could I ask my granny to take this image? I am born and bred in North Antrim, and the true North Antrim fashion, I always say, if you can't show your granny your image, you shouldn't have it on your phone.